it at the end or something?
We can. It's not live.
No.
Oh, no, here we go. Just popped up.
Item D, roll call. Please call the roll.
Mr. Bunsell.
Here.
Mr. Gabbard.
Here.
Mr. Geraci.
Here.
Mr. Kelch. Here. Mr. DiNardo.
Here.
Mr. Thompson.
Here.
Mr. Braden.
Here.
All members present? Okay. Item E, amendment of agenda. I have several items for your consideration. Beginning right after the agenda, we have Dr. Frank Perino here this evening to give us an update. So we'd like to do that right after we vote on the amendment of the agenda. We have ordinance number 9, ordinance to change appropriations for the year 2020. Item 10 will be, K10 will be ordinance to extend the filing date of the annual returns for the tax year 2019. Item 11 is the ordinance adjusting certain salary ranges. And also in item P, communications, we have a letter from Mayor Schneider. And I think that concludes the amendments to the agenda. May I have a motion? Mr. Braden.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to make a motion that we amend the agenda as stated, please.
Mr. Thompson. Second by Mr. Thompson. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bunsell.
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard.
Yes.
Mr. Geraci.
Yes.
Mr. Kelch.
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo.
Yes.
Mr. Thompson.
Yes.
Mr. Braden.
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye. The motion passes. Now I would like to welcome Dr. Frank Perino from the Norwood Health Department. He is here tonight to give council an update. I know they've been working very hard to keep everyone informed, and they are an incredible resource for our community. Dr. Perino.
Thank you. Just want to update council. I'm hoping everyone has been receiving updates on a regular basis. If you get too tired of them, because there's a lot of information that keeps coming out, just let us know and we'll back off. But right now, we are in the upswing, I think, of this crisis that's hitting us right now. I think Ohio's a little bit behind, which is good, but hopefully we can continue to what they call flatten the curve. The social distancing is, I'm hoping, will work, but there are people that tend to break it, so we're keeping an eye on, and our job is to help encourage and enforce the social distancing and closures of businesses and whatever new comes along. All this is happening because the coronavirus, as you probably have heard, especially as of today, we had 564 cases in Ohio, and that's confirmed cases, so they've been tested. Those are the ones that have been tested. These are spread out over 49 counties. Hamilton County personally has 38 now. There have been 145 hospitalized and 8 deaths at this point. One of the keys is, and I handed out a packet, the curve that's shown, it's an older display of a curve, but the whole point is there's a big peak like we saw in China, in South Korea, and even in Italy, that if the system gets overwhelmed and we peak quickly with too many cases, we're not going to be equipped to handle the situation medically, so people are going to go without care in the hospitals with ventilators, etc. New York is starting to experience that right now. So the whole point with the social distancing is to decrease the rapidness of spread and even hopefully then stop the spread at some point in time, and we don't have a timeline on when that will happen. Just want to clarify, apparently I heard there was a post on Facebook that there was a confirmed case in Norwood. At this point in time, we have no confirmed cases that the health department is aware of. And the health department will hear when ODH hears, so there may be some cases, and actually being a primary care doctor, we're even asked, if you have symptoms and it's very highly likely that you have the disease, you shelter in place, you quarantine yourself or isolate yourself, unless you start having medical issues, especially this is attacking lungs and heart. So unless you have to go to the hospital, some people are not going to be tested because we don't have enough test kits. Now that is improving, and actually when we call test kits, I was actually had a clarification, at least for Christ Hospital, a lot of that are just not enough viral swabs. So it takes certain swabs, the media, that's, you put it in to be sent off, to be tested, and it's taking 5 to 8 days to get results. So those official tests have shown, as I mentioned before, 564 cases in Ohio, but that probably is not all that are infected. So that's why we're cautious. When you're sick, stay home. Again, it's a virus. There is no antibiotics. There are a couple medicines right now that are being studied and saved for right now the sickest of the patients when they're on the ventilators. So you're going to hear more about that, but I don't know that I need to bring that up to council at this point. Just to point out, we have 25% of the cases have been in the hospital, 11% are in the ICUs, and a little bit more concerning, although it's probably because we're testing more, 16% are healthcare workers that are already infected. So despite doing our best, and again, a lot of these cases are being spread before people are sick, before they know they're sick, before they run the fever. It's not the flu that you feel sick and the next day you're down and out. It's 3 or 4 day process of developing. It usually goes with fever. It's not as frequent a head congestion, and in Cincinnati, sinuses are kicking up. We're still dealing with flu. We still have, as my daughter mentioned, adenoviruses getting ready to hit the kids. So separating which infection is which is important, but it's been very difficult. And hopefully new testing and a quicker test coming on board in the city in particular will be helpful. It should be able to find out test results within the day. They're talking 45 minutes. So hopefully that will speed up our testing and reports, which then can tell us who is sick and who needs to be quarantined, set off to the side, etc. The health department has been asked to monitor some patients. It's called patients under investigation, or PUI. You've probably seen that term. There's a lot more terms that we really need to know about in this world, but a new one is PUI. So we've monitored a couple. We've not come up with any problems. There was one case that wasn't quite responding to some phone calls, but the cajoling got our reports that we needed, and he's doing fine. So far all is good. We are going to be taxed with the work to follow if they're positives instead of just these persons of interest or under investigation. So at some point in time, like I said, I think we're in the upswing of the curve. We're going to see more cases. We're going to see more sickness in this area. So hopefully we can at least limit the downstream exposures and not as many people get as sick as quick. There's a few other graphs in the back of the papers, I think just more interesting. Amount of hospital beds that we have available. Governor Cuomo with New York was very early on showing how many ICU beds they have, how many ventilators they have, and all of a sudden, boom, they're being taken up. So the whole point is spread out the disease, lessen the acuteness, and hopefully everyone gets by. The social distancing, hand washing, hand washing, hand washing. Surfaces have to be washed down. Even microphones, we've heard about the basketball player playing around with the microphone, and sure enough, a couple days later, he's making fun of it, and now he was sick with the virus. So whether it came from direct contact or microphones or but it does stay on surfaces, more solid surfaces. Paper and cardboard and all are just a day that it stays alive, so protect yourselves, protect the elderly. The health department has reached out a number of times to our elderly through either the senior center that we have in town, the senior nursing home, ECF, that we have in town. We were in contact with them very early on, and it seems like, okay, you're way too early, but you have to get used to it. Even walking in here today, getting ready to shake a hand, because that's what we do. We have to relearn to be more cautious at this point in time, and especially the elderly. The ages of people dying is much higher in the elderly with more complicated diseases such as respiratory and cardiac issues, and this virus attacks those systems more significantly, so that's why we have to pay more attention. Although young people are still dying, it's a lot less frequent. So, is there anything I left out that any interest I can answer?
Mr. Thompson?
Yeah, hi, thanks for being here. I was just wondering if you've gotten any information about when more available testing will start to come online here in Ohio as a state, and I can only imagine how frustrating it is as a medical worker to not be able to test people who you think might have the disease but don't meet this criteria or that criteria. And it's certainly not a great way to build a data set to learn from. Do you know when we're going to be ramping up?
Well, first off, it has been very challenging on the medical community. The statement has been that the swabbing and the testing should be more available this week, and we keep getting supplies coming in, but I was expecting it last week from what we heard, but places had to shut down because they're trying to just swab the very sick, because there have been some different clinics open up and have to shut down or limit their time. So it keeps coming in, but how much of the supplies and how quickly we go through it I'm not sure when that.
Any other questions? Comments? Thank you, Dr. Perino.
Are we getting enough information to everyone? Is there anything else? I mean, you can always call the health department if we're sending out information that you're not understanding. We're here to help. I've given a couple talks, so again, if you need me, reach out to the health department. Gina, the nurse, Brian, over there, we've limited our staff as well, so if we can be of any assistance, don't hesitate to call.
Thank you. Thank you.
And same with the public, by the way.
What's that telephone number?
Dr. Perino, what's that telephone number for those watching?
For which one?
The telephone number for the health department, if they
For
can
the health
call.
department, 458-4600.
Thank you, sir.
All right, thank you.
Moving forward to item F1, minutes of February 25th, 2020 meeting. May I have a motion to approve the minutes? Mr. DiNardo?
Yep, a motion to approve the minutes.
Motion by Mr. DiNardo. May I have a second? Second by Mr. Kelch. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bunsell.
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard.
Yes.
Mr. Geraci.
Yes.
Mr. Kelch.
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo.
Yes.
Mr. Thompson.
Yes.
Mr. Braden.
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye, the motion passes. Item F2, minutes from the March 5th, 2020 special meeting. May I have a motion to accept the minutes? Mr. DiNardo?
Motion to accept.
Motion by Mr. DiNardo to accept. Mr. Geraci?
I'll make a second.
Second by Mr. Geraci. Any discussion?
No typo.
Your city special? Yeah. Okay. We'll make sure that, okay. Please call the roll.
Mr. Bunsell.
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard.
Yes.
Mr. Geraci.
Yes.
Mr. Kelch.
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo.
Yes.
Mr. Thompson.
Yes.
Mr. Braden.
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye, the motion passes. Moving on to item G, request to address council on agenda items. We don't have any requests this evening. Item H, we have no reports for the standing committees of council. Item I, third readings of ordinance and resolutions. We do not have any this evening. Mr. DiNardo.
Yeah, for the standing committee meetings, we had a finance committee scheduled for tomorrow.
Correct.
It's not happening anymore. And we'll kind of figure out when the appropriate time to meet will be in a few weeks.
Okay, thank you, Mr. DiNardo. Item I, third readings of ordinances or resolutions. We don't have any this evening. Item J, second reading ordinance and resolutions. We don't have any this evening. That brings us to item K1. Item K1, ordinance authorizing the mayor and safety service director to enter into a collective bargaining agreement with Local 914 and Ohio Council 8 of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, AFL-CIO, consistent with the terms of the attached Exhibit A for the period from January 1st, 2020 through December 31st, 2021, and declaring an emergency. Mr. Thompson.
One request before we continue. We're going through a lot of ordinances today, and I know that several of them are required to make the financial recovery plan sound and whole, whereas others might be able to not necessarily need to have the rules suspended and have all three readings this evening. If when we address each one of these, if it could be made clear that this is necessary for the passage of the financial recovery plan, to make sure that everything lines up properly, or if it's something that can have three readings, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Mr. Bonsall?
Thank you, Mr. President. So I think it's something that I was going to bring up in new business, but I think it might be relevant to that request. I mean, there's a chance that if we get most of the stuff done that we need to get done, that we may not need to meet at least that first meeting in April, and it's something we can talk about. So I would just keep that in mind, that if
we're not on discussion yet. We need to make a motion on this first.
Forgive me.
My bad.
Do I have a motion?
I'll make a motion.
Motion by Mr. Gabbard. Do I have a second?
What is your motion?
My motion is to have all three readings of this particular ordinance.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Braden.
Second.
Second by Mr. Braden. Any discussion? Mr. Thompson.
Would somebody like to please clarify if this is required to meet the financial recovery plan?
Yes, sir.
I can answer it, or the auditor's here. I'll defer to the auditor.
Mr. Stith.
This is one of the 4 contracts that are mentioned within the plan, and it is built into the plan, but I think that it's more appropriate to discuss, since this contract has been brought to council, they have to decide tonight, or doesn't it default in? That's a question back to through the chair to the mayor or the law director.
Depending on the next meeting.
We've got, let me see, 14 days of reaching, required to present. Okay, the date of presentation is March 20th. Council has 30 days to accept or reject.
Okay. Does that help you, Mr. Thompson?
If I may.
Mr. Mayor.
30 days does not get it completed before we have to put the FRP to the commission. So yes, there is a time necessity here, absolutely.
Mr. Thompson.
Thanks. That's all I wanted to know, was that some of these are going to be time sensitive, whereas others are not. I just wanted, as we go through, I'm a fan of having 3 readings when we're able to. I just want to make sure we do that when we can.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
I mean, 3 separate readings.
I understand what you're saying.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any further discussion? Mr. DiNardo.
Yeah, I'm kind of speaking to my fellow council members. This, number 1 and 2, not only, Eric, are they in my mind necessary for the timing standpoint of getting the financial recovery plan in order. it's also an opportunity to kind of put to bed what's been kind of lingering around since the turn of the year. So the fact that these are brought forward and the mayor was able to kind of work with the union presidents and get the respective unions to tentatively agree is, I think, a great step forward, and hopefully our vote recognizes that.
Thank you, Mr. DiNardo. Mr. Kelch.
I would like to agree with Mr. DiNardo there. The mayor has done a lot of good work here, especially the union presidents coming to negotiate as well, and especially the one in particular that pertains to public works employees. I think they've done an outstanding job in the past. I think they continue to do an outstanding job. Even since we've taken office, they've done a lot of work for us to hit the ground running and smoothly. And I think the least we can do is get them a contract here tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Kelch. Mr. Gabbard.
I'd like to go through the chair to the mayor just to ask for his comments on this particular contract.
Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. I think in both of these contracts, both 914 and 3278, they came to the table ready to talk. They were very interested in moving forward. They're getting 0% increase this year. They are getting a small increase, 2.5% next year, but they were willing to discuss and be very open to, the city side of some of the things that we brought to it, and we were willing to discuss with them. And really, I mean, both of them, I echo Councilman Kelch's sentiments. They were very willing to work with the city and help us get this completed in a timely manner so that we could get it on the financial recovery plan. I mean, all of these numbers are put into the financial recovery plan. We're so close to that. So, yeah, I really feel like they did a good job. And of course, we've got Clemens & Nelson, which is the law firm that's been negotiating with these unions for years now. And they were instrumental in working through this also. Absolutely.
Mr. Bonsall.
Thank you, Mr. President. Have both unions voted to approve to ratify the contract at this point?
Yes, sir. Both unions have voted and both unions have passed this. Yes.
Thank you.
Any further discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bonsall?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye. The motion passes. May we have all three readings?
Ordinance authorizing the mayor and safety service director to enter into a collective bargaining agreement with Local 914 and Ohio Council 8 of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, AFL-CIO, consistent with the terms of the attached Exhibit A, for the period from January 1st, 2020 through December 31st, 2021, and declaring an emergency. Ordinance authorizing the mayor and safety service director to enter into a collective bargaining agreement with Local 914 and Ohio Council 8 of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, AFL-CIO, consistent with the terms of the attached Exhibit A, for the period from January 1, 2020 through December 31st, 2021, and declaring an emergency. Ordinance authorizing the mayor and safety service director to enter into a collective bargaining agreement with Local 914 and Ohio Council 8 of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, AFL-CIO, consistent with the terms of the attached Exhibit A, for the period from January 1st, 2020 through December 31st, 2021, and declaring an emergency.
May I have a motion? Mr. DiNardo?
A motion to vote on this and pass this.
Thank you, Mr. DiNardo. Mr. Braden?
I second that.
Second by Mr. Braden. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bonsall?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye. The motion passes.
Yes.
Item K2.
Keep moving.
Item K2, ordinance authorizing the mayor and safety service director to enter into a collective bargaining agreement with Local 3278 and Ohio Council 8 of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, AFSCME, AFL-CIO, consistent with the terms of the attached Exhibit A for the period from January 1st, 2020 through December 31st, 2021, and declaring an emergency. Mr. Geraci.
Make a motion to have all 3 readings.
Mr. Geraci makes a motion to have all 3 readings. Mr. DiNardo. Second by Mr. DiNardo. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bonsall?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye. The motion passes. May we have all 3 readings, please?
Ordinance authorizing the mayor and safety service director to enter into a collective bargaining agreement with Local 3278 and Ohio Council 8 of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, AFS-CME, AFL-CIO, consistent with the terms of the attached Exhibit A, for the period from January 1st, 2020 through December 31st, 2021, and declaring an emergency. Ordinance authorizing the mayor and safety service director to enter into a collective bargaining agreement with Local 3278 and Ohio Council 8 of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, AFS-CME, AFL-CIO, consistent with the terms of the attached Exhibit A, for the period from January 1st, 2020 through December 31st, 2021, and declaring an emergency. Ordinance authorizing the mayor and safety service director to enter into a collective bargaining agreement with Local 3278 and Ohio Council 8 of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, AFS-CME, AFL-CIO, consistent with the terms of the attached Exhibit A, for the period from January 1st, 2020 through December 31st, 2021, and declaring an emergency.
May I have a motion to approve the ordinance? Mr. Gabbard.
Make the motion to approve.
Motion by Mr. Gabbard. Mr. Thompson.
Second.
Second by Mr. Thompson. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bonsall?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye. The ordinance passes.
Thank you.
All these contracts, good job.
Item K3, ordinance authorizing the mayor or safety service director to enter into a letter agreement with Thomas McCabe to serve as fire chief, consistent with the terms of the attached Exhibit A, and declaring an emergency. May I have a motion? Mr. Thompson.
Yeah, I would motion we have all 3 readings.
Motion by Mr. Thompson to have all 3 readings. Mr. Kelch.
Second.
Second by Mr. Kelch. Any discussion?
Yeah.
Mr. DiNardo.
Yeah, just to help with your request, this too is also part of it. You know, this is one of the things that's necessary to get done, not just from the fact that the numbers are baked in the plan, but there are knock-on effects of that.
Mr. Thompson.
I make that request. I realize we all know, but the people watching at home do not.
No, that's great. So that's what I was trying
I just want y'all to know.
Thank you, Mr.
I
Thompson.
understand.
Cool.
Mr. Braden? Mr. Bonsall?
Thank you, Mr. Miracle. So I just want to note, just because like any one of these contracts is in the plan does not mean we have to approve it before we approve the plan, so, or before the plan gets approved by the commission. So, I mean, if we want to do all 3 readings on this tonight, I mean, I think that's fine. I've read through it. I've talked to the mayor about it. But I don't think anybody should feel like they have to vote on this today just because the Fiscal Recovery Commission is coming up on, I guess, next Tuesday. Thank you,
Mr. Braden.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm having a hard time hearing. Can you repeat the motions that's on the floor, please?
The motion was to have all 3 readings.
And seconded by Mr. DiNardo?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
That's correct. Any further discussion? Mr. Mayor?
Well, if one of you guys can.
Mr. Gabbard?
I'd like to go through the chair to the mayor for his
Mr. Mayor.
comments.
Thank you. You know, in light of the situation we're in right now, having your chain of command and having all of those things set in place for your emergency services is really, it puts a spotlight on how critically important it is to have that structure in place for your emergency services. Having the fire chief in place as the fire chief, not an acting fire chief, having him with all the responsibilities really appointed and having those responsibilities upon his shoulders is good for the city of Norwood. I agree that it's not because of the plan. I recommend that this gets passed because it's important to have that structure in place. One of the other positions is our interim health department, health commissioner. We should have a health commissioner in place, and we should recognize in the future how important these positions are. That structure is there for a reason. In an emergency situation, it's critical to have it. I think Tom McCabe is a great candidate for this and will do a great job for us. He's carried this burden for a while now, just because of his career, and this is what he does. But making it true and factual is important, and I think that's one of the reasons why it's necessary to pass it in 3 readings tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
I had another question.
Mr. DiNardo.
For the mayor, are there any details, I know we were all able to read it, that, you can comment on the public, details in the letter? If not its makeup, then some of the things that you felt you or he felt were important to be in the offer letter for the city to know about?
Mr. Mayor, thank you. One of the things that we've done in here is put a little bit of an incentive in for the fire chief to watch his budget, to work with the city administration and make sure that that office, that organization is running properly, because it is a large portion of our budget. So we've put something in here to say, this is important and pay attention to it. The other thing is, and this is probably the first time we've had in a long time, is the fire chief had to sign off on his classification, on the fire chief classification, which outlines these are the jobs of the fire chief. So he knows exactly, this really sets the playing ground for the fire chief and what our expectations, what the city's expectations are for the fire chief. So, and I think looking at the classification, looking at his job description, Tom McCabe is capable of doing all those things, and that's one of the important factors in this.
And the salary and benefits reflect those responsibilities appropriately.
Absolutely.
Is, I think, what we're voting on as well.
Mr. Bonsall.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. President. One of the items that was important for me, and I think the mayor agreed because it's not in here, is that there's nothing in this contract for the fire chief that is tied to the contract that we have with the IAFF, with the fire union, which means that there's no incentive for, any assistance to be given to try to do what he can to make the fire contract any more expensive, because it doesn't affect him whatsoever. So I think that what's in here is fair. I think that it makes sense, and I think that was a good call by you, Mr. Mayor, doing that, just since he is, managing the fire department, but also a member of your administration. So appreciate that.
Thank you, Mr. Bonsall. Any further discussion? Mr. Braden.
Thank you, Mr. President. I think that's a good point, Mr. Bonsall. I just want to point out that the speediness of in which this has happened. This is our 3rd or 4th contracts now that are handled, and just how fast this is happening. And I just want to commend you, Mr. Mayor, for the work that you're doing, and Mr. Stith and everybody else involved. This is pretty amazing, and I'm proud of you guys. So thank you so much for the work that's involved in this and how the speediness of it. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Braden. Any further discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bonsall?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye, the motion passes. Mrs. Williams, may we have all 3 readings?
Ordinance authorizing the mayor or safety service director to enter into a letter agreement with Thomas McCabe to serve as fire chief, consistent with the terms of the attached Exhibit A, and declaring an emergency. Ordinance authorizing the mayor or safety service director to enter into a letter agreement with Thomas McCabe to serve as fire chief, consistent with the terms of the attached Exhibit A, and declaring an emergency. Ordinance authorizing the mayor or safety service director to enter into a letter agreement with Thomas McCabe to serve as fire chief consistent with the terms of the attached Exhibit A and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Gabbard.
I'd like to make a motion that we pass this.
Motion by Mr. Gabbard to pass the ordinance. Mr. Bonsall.
I'd like to second that.
Second by Mr. Bonsall. Any discussion? Mr.
I'd
Gabbard.
like to thank Mr. McCabe also for, as the mayor mentioned before, he has actually been acting in this role since the fall. This should have probably been taken care of with the last administration, but it wasn't. And I appreciate the mayor jumping on this year and getting that done, but I appreciate him and his staff, and look forward to being able to, one more step for us to continue to move forward with making sure that every department that we have is in order, and we're able to march in step together. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gabbard. Mr. Bonsall.
Yeah, I just want to echo Mr. Gabbard's comments. I also just want to note that, Mr. McCabe's, I think he's done a great job so far. I mean, even on, I think, Saturday night when we had the tornado warning, the unexpected sirens that nobody was really expecting because it wasn't barely raining at that time. I mean, he was jumping online to make sure that Norwood citizens were warned about kind of what the warning was about, and so that was appreciated. And I do think he's been very professional, and looking forward to working with him for at least the next 2 years.
Thank you, Mr. Bonsall.
Yep.
Any further discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bonsall?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye, the ordinance passes. Moving on to item K4, ordinance authorizing the Safety Service Director to enter into a contract for the emergency repair of the storm sewer running north to south in the area south of Norwood Avenue and north of State Route 562 near Linden Avenue behind the Pet Spot within the city of Norwood, Ohio, and declaring an emergency. May I have a motion, please? Mr. Thompson.
For motion, we have all three readings of this ordinance.
Mr. Thompson, motion to have all three readings. Mr. DiNardo? Mr. DiNardo, second. Any discussion? Mr. Thompson.
I believe this is, we've spoke about this before. I don't remember if it was an ordinance to seek a bid or something, but this is for the drain issue underneath Pet Spot where it is undermining the parking pad or concrete pad. It's doing damage to public property, or to, not public property, private property. So it's something that we have to get taken care of expediently, so.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Any further discussion? Mr. Bonsall?
Thank you, Mr. President. Did we have, okay, so this is entering into a contract. Was the contract that we're entering into provided to us? I guess I'm just curious what the cost was of the contract that we're entering into.
Mr. Mayor?
The original quote that came in, the engineer's estimate was over $190,000. When the quotes went out, this is for development, this is $122,000 would be what we're going into for taking care of this. It is budgeted money, it is in public lands and buildings, and it's in the FRP, so.
Perfect,
yes.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Mr. Bonsall. Any further discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bonsall?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye, the motion passes. Mrs. Williams, may we have all three readings, please?
Ordinance authorizing the Safety Service Director to enter into a contract for the emergency repair of the storm sewer running north to south in the area south of Norwood Avenue and north of State Route 562 near Linden Avenue behind the Pet Spot within the city of Norwood, Ohio, and declaring an emergency. Ordinance authorizing the Safety Service Director to enter into a contract for the emergency repair of the storm sewer running north to south in the area south of Norwood Avenue and north of State Route 562 near Linden Avenue behind the Pet Spot within the city of Norwood, Ohio, and declaring an emergency. Ordinance authorizing the Safety Service Director to enter into a contract for the emergency repair of the storm sewer running north to south in the area south of Norwood Avenue and north of State Route 562, near Linden Avenue, behind the Pet Spot, within the city of Norwood, Ohio, and declaring an emergency.
Thank you, Mrs. Williams. May I have a motion? Mr. DiNardo.
Motion to pass.
Motion by Mr. DiNardo. Mr. Kelch.
I'd like to second.
Second by Mr. Kelch. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bunsell.
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard.
Yes.
Mr. Geraci.
Yes.
Mr. Kelch.
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo.
Yes.
Mr. Thompson.
Yes.
Mr. Braden.
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye, the ordinance passes. Moving on to item K5, ordinance authorizing the Safety Service Director to advertise for bids and to enter into a contract to replace the roof system of the Norwood Municipal Building at 4645 Montgomery Road and declaring an emergency. Mr. Thompson.
On motion, we have the first reading of this ordinance.
I'm
First
sorry.
reading of this ordinance.
First reading. We have a motion by Mr. Thompson for the first reading of the ordinance. May I have a second? Mr.
I'll
Kelch?
go ahead and second.
Mr. Kelch, second the motion. So the motion is to have one reading. Any discussion? Discussion. Mr. DiNardo.
Before we do that, I had two questions, actually. The first is, the wording of this is slightly different than we saw with the Pet Spot. I think that this is saying that we're having a reading, and if we were to have three, we could even vote on both getting the bids and entering into the contract in the same time, or would those be two different steps? So that's my first question. I don't know if that's maybe just semantics or whatever. And then the second is, if I could ask the mayor to kind of talk a little bit about the need and how this might be affecting just workplace when you get on. So two different questions, I suppose.
Yes.
The first question I'll defer to the law director on. My understanding is that this would allow us to go through the bid process.
Right.
So put together, we're already working on a bid package, going through the bid process, and then once that comes in, we would go ahead and let the work.
Just initiate it.
Without council. The original quote, you might recall this came in last year in the early summer. There was a quote that came in to the Safety Service Director's office. There was money appropriated to do the work, but the work wasn't completed, mostly because it came in well above where the Safety Service Director could do it. So it ended up going into the bid process, and so that's the process that we're going through now. It's been leaking for a year. Just coming into the office the other day in the auditorium area, there's a huge amount of damage to the plaster along the walls where it's leaking down the walls, but there's even plaster coming down from the very center of the room. There's a spot. So my thoughts are, this is important. Let's get a new roof on it now, quicker than putting it off. But it's up to you guys on what you want to do. I mean, it's like I said, it's been leaking for a year. It can leak for another 2 months. It'll probably take 2 months after that for the roofers to mobilize and get out there and do it. But it's, my thoughts were just, for the emergency clause, it was just, let's make this happen quickly. I think the way it's, can I do?
Sure. Mr. Moore?
Mr. Moore about that?
The mayor's absolutely correct.
Yes.
It's two different kinds of ordinances. This one would be council's approving to go for bids and to let the contract based on the lowest and best bid.
I understand.
Mr. Kelch?
Through the chair to the mayor, do we have any figures on the old bid that was put in, and are we seeking new bids, or are we trying to go with the same company that put in that bid?
Mr. Mayor?
We will get new bids, but the original bid was $80,000. And we put in, we just basically, that's what was put in the budget before, so we just put that in the FRP. Hopefully it'll be less. Hopefully, always, you know.
Mr. Geraci?
I do think this is another one that should be passed with all three readings tonight, because we can't sit another 2 or 3 months waiting on this roof to be repaired and fixed. As much rain as we've been getting lately and how much is predicted over the next 2 weeks, we're going to see that building start coming down even more.
Thank you, Mr. Geraci. Mr. Kelch?
I do agree with the importance on this, and I would, if I'm possible, like to remove my second. To have the first, just to have the one reading, I'd like to remove my second if possible.
You want to rescind your
Yes.
motion to have one reading?
Yes.
Okay.
No, I didn't, my motion, I second.
You second Mr.
Thompson's motion.
Thompson.
I'd like to rescind my second.
You want to rescind your second?
Yes.
Okay. And you're still,
I'm going to hold it.
you're with your motion for one reading, correct? Okay. Mr. Bonds?
So, I mean, the motion is made. I don't think, can somebody rescind a second without the, other motion being made? I mean, we've already had the discussion on it. I would say just call it for a vote, and if it fails, we can make a motion for all 3 readings.
Is that correct, Mr. Moore?
He can withdraw his second, and so now we have a motion with no second on the floor, waiting to see if anyone will second it. If nobody seconds it, then the motion fails, and somebody else gets a chance to make a motion.
Yeah. Cool. Thanks.
So do we have a second? Mr. Braden?
Discussion?
We're looking for a second. Okay.
I'm having a hard time hearing what
What happened was there was a motion for one reading. Mr. Kelch seconded. Now Mr. Kelch has rescinded his second. So we do have a motion for one reading, but we're asking for a second if there is a second.
Okay, thank you.
Do I have a second? So that,
Motion fails.
so the motion fails. Mr. DiNardo?
I'd like to make a motion to have all 3 readings.
Mr. DiNardo has made a motion for all 3 readings. Mr. Kelch?
I'd like to second that motion.
Second by Mr. Kelch for all 3 readings. Discussion, Mr. DiNardo.
Yeah, just to give a little bit of color of why I decided to go for all 3 readings in this. The first is I do think it's a need. The second is I'm concerned about our ability to properly meet over the next couple meetings, and I think there's a good reason why we're not going to meet for the next, potentially not meet for the next couple meetings, but that's just weighing on my mind. So timing is kind of playing into that. And then thirdly is more of a general point, I suppose, on there's a lot of expenditures that over the past 2 meetings, this one, I mean, we got a big old list of stuff that is money leaving the city. It's important to note, and I kind of came to grips with the fact that we baked a lot of that in to the financial recovery plan that we're going to be passing. And we're still planning on a particular level that I'm comfortable with being over that magic number of $1.6 million for the current year with a positive outlook in the future. I know that revenues might be impacted by the coronavirus, with people potentially not working for this time. I imagine earnings revenue will go down for next year at some level. I just don't know what. But we also have the opportunity come third, fourth quarter when we're thinking about next year's financial recovery, or hopefully just the budget or the plan rather than rather being in financial emergency. But that will be an appropriate time for us to evaluate our standing and expenditures based on the revenues that we're seeing start to come in. So those are the 3 reasons that I'm okay with this and some of the other emergency expenditures that we feel that we need.
Thank you, Mr. DiNardo. Any further discussion? Mr. Bonsall?
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to very much echo Mr. DiNardo's comments. I think things have changed so much just for our lives in the past 2 weeks. We don't meet for another 3 weeks from today, and we don't know exactly where things are going to be at that point. We have optimistic projections coming from the northeast corner of our country, and then we've got our Ohio governor telling us, look, it could be a while till things are together, and again, we don't know how things are going to change even in the next 3 weeks. So I would definitely recommend for things that have of urgent matter, and I would say this leaking roof is one that we vote to do all 3 readings and get this done. So, thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Bonsall. Mr. Braden?
Thank you, Mr. President. I also think we should probably pass this, and I just think it's another something, we see that this administration is moving at a fast pace and is addressing everything they can address, and so I'm really proud of that. Also, I would be concerned. I would be I remember this roof being done before, so I'm just curious, when you do get the bid process, I would maybe recommend looking at the warranties involved in such a bid. I just remember this roof being done. You know, my roofs are 25, 35-year warranty, so when that happens, I would really recommend looking into the warranty issue, situation when that. So, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Braden. Any further discussion? Mr. Thompson?
At the risk of sounding like a broken record, I think we as a body have to be careful. I believe today, and just looking forward, we're probably going to pass 11 ordinances on emergency clauses by suspending the rules. There are actually reasons why those rules were put in place to have those 3 readings at separate times. There are often cases when we do have actual emergencies, when we do need to suspend the rules and pass things in cases like financial recovery plan, the contracts and such. But I don't know if everybody here is aware. I'm sure everybody listening in isn't aware why we have 3 readings. First part is to give the public opportunity to hear what we're discussing and to have an opportunity to actually come in and to comment on that. Second reason is because of something that nobody actually does, but it's one reason we do it, is the opportunity to have a referendum, which means the public can actually gather signatures to go against something that council wants to do. There are reasons why we do 3 separate readings and spread things out. I'm not discounting what you're saying about the need for an emergency, but there is a reason why these rules are in place, and I don't believe we should govern by suspending them continually. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Mr. Geraci?
To Mr. Thompson, I appreciate what you're saying. I do. And I understand it completely. I myself do know all about declaring an emergency and what it should be about. However, I cannot tell you how much I've heard since probably February, March of last year about how we as a city need to start getting our own buildings in order before we start going after our residents. And we've heard the residents talk about how much City Hall needs repairs to the roof. The roof damaged council chambers. The roof is causing damage down at the bottom of City Hall on the bricks. This, in my opinion, tells me that the residents have spoken over the last year about this, and we need to get something like this passed since we do have the funding there.
Thank you, Mr. Geraci. Any further discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bunsell?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
No.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present, 6 ayes, 1 no. The motion passes. Do we have all 3 readings?
Ordinance authorizing the Safety Service Director to advertise for bids and enter into a contract to replace the roof system of the Norwood Municipal Building at 4645 Montgomery Road and declaring an emergency. Ordinance authorizing the Safety Service Director to advertise for bids and enter into a contract to replace the roof system of the Norwood Municipal Building at 4645 Montgomery Road and declaring an emergency. Ordinance authorizing the Safety Service Director to advertise for bids and to enter into a contract to replace the roof system of the Norwood Municipal Building at 4645 Montgomery Road and declaring an emergency.
Thank you, Mrs. Williams. May I have a motion? Mr. Geraci?
I'll make a motion to pass.
Motion by Mr. Geraci. May I have a second? Mr. DiNardo? Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bunsell?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye, the ordinance passes. We move on to item K6, Ordinance approving the third amendment to the detailed financial plan for the city of Norwood and declaring an emergency. May I have a motion? Mr. DiNardo.
I motion to have all three readings.
Mr. DiNardo makes a motion for all three readings. Mr. Bonsall.
I'd like to second that motion.
Second by Mr. Thompson. Any discussion? I mean, Mr. Bonsall, forgive me. I was looking at you and...
We look so much alike.
Any discussion? Mr. Bonsall?
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, just to explain, I truly feel that all of the ordinances that we've had, there's two different things. There's the emergency clause and the suspending the rules to do all three readings. I think it's necessary here, and I think it was necessary for the ones that we've already done it on. For this one, we have the Financial Recovery Commission that's coming up next Tuesday, so it has to get approved before then. Suspending the rules lets us vote on it, but then the emergency clause that's in here, as Mr. Thompson noted, it allows it to go into effect immediately so that it can actually be effective when the commission meets. And so, anyways, I do think that we should vote to do all three readings on this one. We have talked about this, so we've been talking about this financial recovery plan. We've had it in our hands for about 2 weeks now. We've talked about a finance committee multiple times before that. I've met with the mayor about this plan and had a chance to review it with him, ask a lot of questions, get feedback. So, I think that for me, I think that it's a good plan that really sets us on a good course for the future. And there's also, I've heard people that have expressed concerns because potentially revenue could be down this year. We don't know, to what impact, but there's cushion in this plan that, we'll be able to adjust it next year if there is a little revenue down this year. So, for all those reasons, I do think that we should approve it. I think it's going to set us on a good path, and I'll be excited to be voting yes for all three readings.
Thank you, Mr. Bonsall.
Yep.
Mr. DiNardo?
Well, I echo everything you said, and that was really well put. I guess a little bit of a tag for the six of you guys is a lot of residents either reached out or emailed to me after the Finance Committee meeting. That's where we kind of went through a lot of the major assumptions that were in there, and although I didn't see what you emailed today, Mr. Stith, it didn't appear up to today that there were any material changes from when we spoke about at the Finance Committee meeting. Right? Material being something that would make me kind of peek my head up or feel that you residents are missing out on something that we didn't talk about before. That's just important to note because time did pass since we last met, and I'd still think for you guys this is something we can move forward with, the plan that you received today.
Thank you, Mr. DiNardo. Mr. Kelch?
Yeah, I'd like to say outstanding job to everybody involved in this process. I think this is a very good budget. It's one of the first steps leading towards getting off fiscal recovery and a better Norwood overall. I'd just like to extend a good job to everybody involved.
Thank you, Mr. Kelch.
Thanks, man.
Mr. Dracy?
On this one, would I have loved to have 3 separate readings on this one? Absolutely. But I think this doesn't fit my definition of last minute, as Mr. Bonsall has said and Mr. DiNardo has said. We've been going over this for the past couple months, and we've had a lot of public hearings on it. I believe we got the email on this somewhat final draft Thursday, and I know I've been going over it all weekend. So I do appreciate all the hard work between the Finance Committee, Mr. Stith, the mayor, and everybody else involved with this.
Thank you, Mr. Dracy. Mr. Bonsall. Mr. Braden.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to echo that. That's well said. Also, I wanted to just bring up the thank you for Mr. Stith. You know, this is the third amendment to this, so I'm thinking 100 hours or so. I really appreciate the hard work that the administration as well as the auditor's office has put into this. So lots of time. I don't know if people realize that, but lots of time has been put into this.
Thank you, Mr. Braden.
Mr. Bonsall.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. President. I also just want to note that we could not have done the 3 readings over at least the last 3 separate council meetings, because if we would have adjusted the plan, then we would have had to do the reading again, or at least that's always been my understanding. And so, long story short is, that's the reason why we're having to do all 3 readings of this meeting. I know Mr. DiNardo early on wanted to do at least 1 reading at the last meeting, but it was always known that the state still had to approve it. There was probably going to be just some minor changes, and there were, and which is why, it was better just to do the 3 readings at this meeting. So just want to note that, why we had to do it now. I guess if, there are council members that didn't want to vote for all 3, we could schedule special meetings all this week to do it, but I wouldn't want to put that, I don't think that's an appropriate way to go either when we've got a really solid plan right in front of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bonsall. Any further discussion?
Yeah.
Mr. Bonsall.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would just be curious if the auditor has anything to say on this.
Mr. Stitt.
Yes, thank you, Mr. President. Just for anybody who's got the printed copies of these and everybody else out there, they're going to be online in the next day or two to download. Page 20 is really the crux. That's actually the real bottom line. And what it shows, at the end of this year, we're still going to have a $2.6 million carryover if we spend every dime that's in here, which is doubtful. And so we do have a cushion to be able to flex that should, as we anticipate some economic woes here, that's built in. We'll be working on the new plan. Actually, I started on 2021's plan today. So it won't be this crunch that we have with a new mayor and a new council and everybody to try to get this together within a 3-month period. The deadline to have this passed is the 26th. So if you want to have more than 1 readings, we've got about 48 hours. It has to be passed by the 26th because that's the date the last one was passed. It's presented before the Fiscal Emergency Commission on the 31st, but we have to pass it by and get it to them on the 26th. They have to receive it from us. But page 20 is the most interesting. I do want to say that this plan, unlike the prior plans for this city, has been completely written by us. Meaning working with the mayor, working with finance committee and members of council, and working with people in my office, this is wholly the city's plan. If you remember the first time a plan was passed, council walked in and it was on their desk. None of us, including me, had seen it prior to that day. The second plan, we had a small amount of input. Last year we did work with the state, but the state wrote a pretty good amount of it. This year they let us write it, went back and forth with us, kind of going over to make sure and work with us to make sure that everything was in here and was proper and that everything met their guidelines. But this was written by us, which is a key when we're talking about getting out of fiscal emergency, being able to maintain that process of creating a 5-year plan every year. So a lot of time did go into this from a lot of different people, but this is ours.
Thank you, Mr. Stith. Mr. Braden.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Stiff, thank you. You're a real asset to this community. I appreciate that. I'd be curious if Mr. Snyder would have anything to say about that.
I can't echo much more than what Jim, I can say Jim has spent countless hours in the auditor's office, and his staff has spent countless hours putting together the numbers and making sure things are right. And quite frankly, the auditor of the state, both of the people that have been working with us, both Anna Mary and April have done they've done a ton of work going back and forth and looking at the plan and really digesting what's in the plan and then coming back with some really great suggestions for changes. Now, Jim might not agree that they were great suggestions for changes because he had, a sheet of 30 things that they said change this and round out these numbers and do all that. But he really did a great job on putting the numbers together. The auditor's office did a great job. And really, I would say that this process, as Jim stated at the end, has been a great process for the city of Norwood to go through. It puts us on a 5-year plan. It really helps us understand what we're doing, and I think we're much better and a much stronger community for it.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Any further discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bonso?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye, the motion passes. Mrs. Williams, may we have all 3 readings?
Ordinance approving the third amendment to the detailed financial plan for the city of Norwood and declaring an emergency. Ordinance approving the third amendment to the detailed financial plan for the city of Norwood and declaring an emergency. Ordinance approving the third amendment to the detailed financial plan for the city of Norwood and declaring an emergency.
May I have a motion? Mr. Bonsall.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that we pass the ordinance.
Motion by Mr. Bonsall. Mr. Braden.
I second that.
Second by Mr. Braden. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bonso?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye, the ordinance passes. Item K7, ordinance authorizing the adoption of an alternate method of apportioning the local government fund. May I have a motion? Mr. DiNardo.
Motion for the first reading of this. I don't know much about it, so.
I'm sorry.
The first reading.
First reading?
Yeah.
Motion by Mr. DiNardo for the first reading. Mr. Braden? Do you have your hand up, sir? Okay. Mr. Bonsall?
Yeah, I'll second that.
Second by Mr. Bonsall. The motion is for one reading. Any discussion? Mr. Bonsall?
Thank you, Mr. President. I know that there is a deadline of this on the, I think it's the 30th of April, I read in the letter. I'm not sure, though, that us saying yes or no necessarily kills it. I'd be curious if the auditor, if you don't mind, Mr. Chair, if he could speak on this to see what he thinks.
Mr. Stith?
Yes, Mr. President. This deals with the local government funds that are provided from the state. Basically, this is sales tax, which is collected from our community, sent to the state. The state then sends that portion, or some of what's collected, back to the county. The County Budget Commission's job is every 8 years to create an apportionment of that money that comes in on a yearly basis and say, City of Norwood gets this percentage of it. And they're required to do that every 8 years, and the next time it's due is in 2021, because they did one in 2012, so before 2021's money comes, in 2020, they have to meet and agree to that apportionment. When that board meets in, I believe, July, they have to have the support of the surrounding communities, both Cincinnati and the majority of other cities, towns, and villages in Hamilton County have to vote to allow the County Budget Commission to make that decision as to how the money is apportioned. So this city must make a decision as to whether we agree to allow them to apportion the money and set up the system of how it's broken down amongst the communities. We must make that decision to either support that or deny that by April 30th of this year. So we'll have to make our decision one way or the other. There is an Exhibit A that's attached to the documentation which was sent to you that describes in about 2 pages how that process works and how the money is broken down, how that Budget Commission is going to make its decision as to how the funds are divvied up. And then the last document, the last page on that, is a breakdown of each of the communities within Hamilton County and what dollar amount each one of them received from that local government funds in 2017, 2018, and 2019. So that should give you enough information to say, to make up your minds whether you agree using this format that is presented to you to allow the Budget Commission of Hamilton County to decide the breakdown of funds that are coming in for the next 8 years. But we do need to decide by April 30th.
April 30th.
Correct.
Thank you, Mr. Stith. Mr. Geraci?
So on this through the chair to Mr. Stith. So this breakdown shows us right around 300,000. Is that from 2012 to 21, or is that 21 and on?
Mr. Stith?
Yes. Yes, Mr. President, this shows historically what we've made in 17, 18, and 19. If you look at the revenue reports that's produced by my office are available on the website, you can actually track back how much we've gotten each year, going back to, I think I go back to 2005 on the website. The city used to get a lot more every year until 2010 or so, when the state reduced the amount that was coming back to the county.
Thank you, Mr. Stith. Any further discussion? No further discussion? Good, okay. Please call the roll.
Mr. Bunsell.
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard.
Yes.
Mr. Geraci.
Yes.
Mr. Kelch.
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo.
Yes.
Mr. Thompson.
Yes.
Mr. Brady.
Yes, ma'am.
All members voting aye. We approve the first reading.
Ordinance authorizing the adoption of an alternative method of apportioning the local government fund.
Mr. Geraci. Moving on to K8, ordinance consenting to the agreement with the Ohio Department of Transportation, ODOT, regarding the upgrade of the traffic signal at Montgomery Road at Mills Avenue by installing audible pedestrian buttons, etc., and accepting maintenance of these upgrades and declaring an emergency. Mr. Bonson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would just like, if we could ask, is there an urgency on this to have to do all three readings today? Ask the mayor or the law director. I'm not sure exactly where this came from.
Mr. Mayor?
This came from my office, and this is, ODOT already installed and did the work at Mills and Montgomery Road. This is for a resident that we have in the community that is visually impaired, and he uses that intersection. So they made a change to the system there, put audible system in for him, and that works great. But they did it, and it was completed under their funds. But they want us to, much like all the other traffic control systems within the city, we are responsible for the maintenance of that. And this just clarifies that we take on the maintenance of that system that they've already installed. This needs to be done now because the visually impaired person has also asked for this system to be placed at Montgomery Road and Sherman. So right there, really the main intersection, and that's where the bus lets him off. And he had some problems near miss with the car potentially hitting him. He's had some challenges with a new dog, his service dog, and so it would be very helpful there. But for us to move forward with that project, we need to go ahead and take care of ODOT on this part. This is really what I consider to be an ordinance that keeps us in good standing with ODOT, and we are right now trying to work with ODOT on a lot of different projects, and we want them, and they're very willing to work with us on some projects and bring some of their different grant money to the city. So this is really making sure that we keep on the right side of ODOT. We would maintain this system anyway, so it's just an ordinance that will go back to ODOT saying, you guys did the work, we'll keep it running.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Geraci?
I'll make a motion to have all three readings.
Motion by Mr. Geraci to have all three readings. Do I have a second? Mr. Thompson?
Second.
Second by Mr. Thompson. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bonson?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Brady?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye, the motion passes. Mrs. Williams, may we have all three readings?
Ordinance consenting to the agreement with the Ohio Department of Transportation, ODOT, regarding the upgrade of the traffic signal at Montgomery Road at Mills Avenue by installing audible pedestrian buttons, etc., and accepting maintenance of these upgrades and declaring an emergency. Ordinance consenting to the agreement with the Ohio Department of Transportation, ODOT, regarding the upgrade of the traffic signal at Montgomery Road and at Mills Avenue by installing audible pedestrian buttons, etc., and accepting maintenance of these upgrades and declaring an emergency. Ordinance consenting to the agreement with the Ohio Department of Transportation, ODOT, regarding the upgrade of the traffic signal at Montgomery Road at Mills Avenue by installing audible pedestrian buttons, etc., and accepting maintenance of these upgrades and declaring an emergency.
Thank you, Mrs. Williams. Mr. Bonsall.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would move that the ordinance be passed.
Motion by Mr. Bonsall. Mr. Kelch.
I'd like to second.
Second by Mr. Kelch. Any discussion? Mr. Bonsall.
Thank you, Mr. President. Yeah, it makes total sense why we should pass this tonight. I'll definitely be supporting that. It's also, I just want to note that it's great that that ODOT has a program in place that allows for improving intersections like this in municipalities without the municipality having to pay for it or contribute a match. So I think that's awesome that they are doing that. I would just say, just note, so there's a few Cincinnati intersections that I've seen. The one I'm going to note is at Dana Avenue, and I think it's Woodburn, right at Xavier, the business school, that there's the audible stuff doesn't sound every time. There's a button to make it sound, so that way, the businesses nearby or what have you, because you can hear it, at least at Xavier, you can hear it in the classrooms at the building that's on the corner. So I would just recommend that if that's possible, maybe to have a button, and there's actually buttons there that I think they don't actually activate the signals. I think the signals are automatic for the pedestrian sign at Montgomery and Sherman, so it could be a good idea to maybe use the buttons that are there or see if they can just put in buttons so that, any of the neighboring businesses there, especially with the new office development that's hopefully going to be going in at Sherman and Montgomery at the old Fidelity building, that maybe it's not always present, that chirping. So just a suggestion, but overall, definitely I'll be supporting this, and thank you for bringing this to us.
Thank you, Mr. Bonsall. Any further discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bonsall?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye, the ordinance passes. The next item, K9, ordinance to change appropriations for the year 2020 and declaring an emergency. Mr. Bonsall.
Thank you, Mr. President. So I would like to move that we have all three readings of this ordinance.
Motion by Mr. Bonsall for all three readings. Mr. DiNardo.
I second that.
Second by Mr. DiNardo.
I have discussion as well. I have discussion as well.
Okay. Mr. Bonsall.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So I just wanted to note that I did request from the, April and Anna Mary that they allow us to go ahead and pass this appropriations ordinance tonight, even though we don't have the fiscal recovery plan approved yet. Just again, there's two reasons. One, just with the uncertainty behind the world that we live in today. There could be two council members that end up coming down with this COVID thing, and we may not be able to, have all three readings at our next council meeting. The second is that if we approve this tonight, and there is a clause in here that says that we're only approving it only goes into effect once the financial recovery plan is passed by the commission. So it's an important note that doesn't go into effect today. It's only when it's passed by the commission. But it allows then the positions that are funded, so like health commissioner, a full-time building commissioner, what have you, the mayor can hire an interim health commissioner that day, the same day the recovery commission approves the financial recovery plan. So I think it's important just for the health of our city so we can actually have a full-time health commissioner in place if the mayor is able to get one that can stand in. And it's also important too that just so that we don't have to meet again a special meeting to approve it, because the work that's in this the appropriations has already been done. It's already in the financial recovery plan that we passed. Everything matches exactly. So I would just recommend that we go ahead and do all three readings tonight, and then if the recovery plan does get approved that we have already passed, that we go ahead and or it would allow it to go ahead and go into effect.
Thank you, Mr. Bonsall. Mr. DiNardo.
That's it.
That's it? Mr. Braden.
Can you clarify the ordinance we're talking about, please?
It's number 9, Mr. Braden. It's the ordinance to change appropriations for the year 2020 and declaring an emergency.
Thank you.
It should be number 9. I marked it number 9. Any further discussion? Please call the roll.
Sorry, hold on. Are we sure that's number 9? I think it should be number 10.
Number 10 is the extended filing date.
Oh, here it is. Something's on there twice. That's why. My apologies, gentlemen. All right, Mr. Bonsall.
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard.
Yes.
Mr. Geraci.
Yes.
Mr. Kelch.
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo.
Yes.
Mr. Thompson.
Yes.
Mr. Braden.
Yes, ma'am.
All members voting aye, the motion passes. Mrs. Williams, may we have all 3 readings?
Ordinance to change appropriations for the year 2020 and declaring an emergency. Ordinance to change appropriations for the year 2020 and declaring an emergency. Ordinance to change appropriations for the year 2020 and declaring an emergency.
Thank you, Mrs. Williams. Mr. Geraci.
Make a motion to pass.
Motion by Mr. Geraci to approve the ordinance. May I have a second, Mr. DiNardo? Second by Mr. DiNardo. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bonsall.
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard.
Yes.
Mr. Geraci.
Yes.
Mr. Kelch.
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo.
Yes.
Mr. Thompson.
Yes.
Mr. Braden.
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye, the ordinance passes. Moving on to K10. Ordinance extending the filing date of annual returns for the tax year 2019 required under the Norwood Tax Code, Norwood Codified Ordinance Sections 182.05G to July 15th, 2020, and declaring an emergency. Mr. Bonsall.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would move that we have all 3 readings of this ordinance.
Motion by Mr. Bonsall to have all 3 readings. Mr. Braden.
I second that.
Second by Mr. Braden. Any discussion? Mr. Bonsall.
Thank you, Mr. President. So this ordinance was requested by the city treasurer. So in light of the federal government extending the tax date, the federal tax date to July 15th, it makes sense to extend the city's tax date partly because, or for the most part because, you have to attach your federal 1040 to the city's tax return. So if you don't have a federal tax return that you filed yet, then it makes it very hard to file the city's one. And I do think that we should do all 3 readings on this ordinance because tax day is coming up April 15th. If we don't do 3 readings and get this thing passed, one, there's kind of some confusion with citizens about what really the date is. And then 2, anybody that files on the 16th or later could be subject to late fees and penalties that the treasurer may not be able to waive just because it's in law. So I do recommend that we go ahead and just get this done with so it's really clear to citizens what their tax date is.
Thank you, Mr. Bonsall. Any further discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bonsall.
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard.
Yes.
Mr. Geraci.
Yes.
Mr. Kelch.
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo.
Yes.
Mr. Thompson.
Yes.
Mr. Braden.
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye, the motion passes. Mrs. Williams, may we have all 3 readings?
Ordinance extending the filing date of annual returns for tax year 2019, required under the Norwood Tax Code, Norwood Codified Ordinance Section 182.05, subsection G, to July 15th, 2020, and declaring an emergency. Ordinance extending the filing date of annual returns for tax year 2019, required under the Norwood Tax Code, Norwood Codified Ordinance Section 182.05, subsection G, to July 15th, 2020, and declaring an emergency. Ordinance extending the filing date of annual returns for tax year 2019, required under the Norwood Tax Code, Norwood Codified Ordinance, Section 182.05, subsection G, to July 15th, 2020, and declaring an emergency.
Thank you, Mrs. Williams. Mr. Geraci.
Make a motion to pass.
Motion by Mr. Geraci to pass the ordinance. Mr. Kelch.
I'd like to second.
Second by Mr. Kelch. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bonsall.
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard.
Yes.
Mr. Geraci.
Yes.
Mr. Kelch.
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo.
Yes.
Mr. Thompson.
Yes.
Mr. Braden.
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye, the ordinance passes. Brings us to item K11, ordinance adjusting certain salary ranges. Mr. Kelch.
I'd like to move that we have all three readings this tonight.
Mr. Kelch made a motion for all three readings. Mr. Geraci.
I'd like to second.
Second by Mr. Geraci. Any discussion? Mr. Thompson.
Yeah, has this been updated at all since the last time we reviewed it prior to the financial recovery plan? I guess interference in the process.
Mr. Mayor.
Mr. Mayor.
Yes, added in was Section 1, which is the ordinance will be effective with the passage of the Financial Recovery Commission's meeting, so they have to meet and approve the Financial Recovery Plan. All the numbers in there are the same. I think Tim and I aligned them a little better. It's actually a little better print, but it's all pretty much the same that was there.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Any further discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bunsell.
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard.
Yes.
Mr. Geraci.
Yes.
Mr. Kelch.
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo.
Yes.
Mr. Thompson.
Yes.
Mr. Braden.
No.
All members present, we have 6 ayes, 1 no. May we have all three readings, Mrs. Williams?
Ordinance adjusting certain salary ranges and amending ordinance number 73-1999, 7-2007, and 33-2009, and declaring an emergency. Ordinance adjusting certain salary ranges and amending ordinance to ordinance number 73-1999, 7-2007, and 33-2009, and declaring an emergency. Ordinance adjusting certain salary ranges and amending ordinance number 73-1999, 7-2007, and 33-2009, and declaring an emergency.
Thank you, Mrs. Williams. Mr. Kelch.
I'd like to make a motion to pass this.
Motion by Mr. Kelch to pass the ordinance. May I have a second? Mr. DiNardo. Second by Mr. DiNardo. Any discussion? Mr. Bonsall.
Thank you, Mr. President. So just so it's known, so all the numbers that are in here, it's all baked into the financial recovery plan based on where, current employees are, or if there's employees that are not hired yet. So things are good in that sense. The other thing is that, again, these positions that are on here, they have not had raises since 2009, I think it's been. So it is, I think it's just important that we, acknowledge that. And many other, departments in the city have had raises since then, but these are our non-union employees. So anyways, I just think it's important that we get this passed. I do support this, and I'm glad that we're finally able to, make a difference for these people's pay ranges from where they used to be.
Thank you, Mr. Bonsall. Mr. Geraci.
While I do have some objections to this ordinance myself, and I know that some other council members may have their objections as well to some of this ordinance, I think that in order to get us moving forward as a city and getting us out of the hole that we're in, which I think we're about 2 or 3 rungs from getting out of, this is essential to us getting out of that hole, and getting people in place and making sure that people are a little more motivated to do a better job in the future. I've heard over the last, week and a half or so, people talking about council and here we go, spend. But you know what? We've got to get people in place in order for us to move forward as a city, to heal as a city, and this is one way we can do it.
Thank you, Mr. Geraci. Mr. Kelch.
I'd like to echo on that, that this isn't new stuff. This is stuff that we've been talking about, and stuff that we were waiting on the FRP to come through and to figure it out if we could work it in. I think the mayor has a very good plan here with what he wants to do, and I would like to see him have what he needs here to make it happen, because I think passing this, we're going to have a better Norwood going forward.
Thank you, Mr. Kelch. Any further discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bonsell?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Brady?
No.
All members present, we have 6 ayes, 1 no. The ordinance passes. Moving on to item L, administrative reports. We don't have any this evening. I don't have any requests to address council. Item N, unfinished business. Do we have any unfinished business? Mr. DiNardo.
This is more of a question that I didn't know how to ask anywhere else. But knowing how we set up this meeting, not only in arrangement, but also some of the actions that took place were because we're unsure about meeting again, definitely in 3 weeks, and who knows after that. Hopefully, soon after. But if there's a possibility that we don't meet for, let's say, a month or 5 weeks or maybe even longer, I know there was a topic that got a lot of heat. It was around Cappies, and we left the last meeting saying when we meet at the beginning of April, we're going to kind of review a general game plan, and there was a bunch of stuff that we wanted to see ticked through. What do we do about that now? We've kind of left it with him coming back and giving that plan, but there's now no time to do that, and I just wanted to have I don't know if it's a discussion or figuring out how to appropriately handle that, because I feel like we set them to do something and we owe that responsibility for them an opportunity to come back. I don't know how, can I ask you guys to just kind of chime in and on your thoughts or where you're at?
Mr. Geraci.
To respond to Mr. DiNardo, I know he hasn't contacted me yet. My information's out on the website. I know residents are able to get to it if, you know, I'm hoping at some point he wants to reach out to me, but, you know, I was one of his biggest adversaries, I guess, and he still has yet to reach out to me. I don't see it. I guess I could just drive up there and try to meet with him, but if he's asking us to do something for him, it would be pertinent of him to at least come and talk to me. I mean...
Mr. Kelch.
I did get to speak with Ben. I'm not even going to try to say his last name because I don't want to butcher it. But he did reach out to me, and I was able to meet with him. And we were able to go over some things that he's wanting to do, some of his plans that he does have, paint schemes and stuff like that he wants to bring to us. I would like him to have the opportunity to maybe reach out to Mr. Geraci and other members of council before we make a decision on it. But he has reached out to me, and he does have things put together that he wants to bring not only to council, and he's working with the building department on as well.
Thank you, Mr. Kelch. Mr. Bonsall.
Thank you, Mr. President. So I've been in contact with Ben as well, and we talked on Wednesday of last week, and I think he was debating whether to come to this meeting or to wait, to the next one. He had things pretty much buttoned up, but I think he didn't know if he had every single item checked off the list. So, I think that he's made significant progress. I know that I personally would be comfortable voting, yes to approve the treks today, if we were to have a vote on that. I know that apparently he hasn't been able to get in contact with at least one council member. So I just want to put that out there that, I feel good about where it's at. He's, like I said, he's taken steps. I think he's got a good plan. And honestly, I think it's time to move forward. I'm not going to rush the process, but I do think that we've been talking about it a very long time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bonsall. Mr. Brady.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. DiNardo, thank you very much for bringing that up. That's really important, and I really, really appreciate you bringing that up. And what I've heard is that it's inevitable he's going to get this. So I agree. Do we vote on it? Do we need a motion? Mr. Question for Mr. Moore.
Mr. Moore.
As far as the tracks transfer, as far as the tracks transfer, It would depend on, if council wants to, somebody tonight could make a motion to approve the trucks transfer, to go ahead, for the city to go ahead and sign that. Other than that, that remains unsigned, and so he does not get that particular license.
Mr. Kelch?
I would like to say that I would not like to vote tonight, and I would like to give him an opportunity to not only reach out to other members of council, but to do the other things that we agreed upon, like not only reaching out to us, making improvements on a plan, but also reaching out to businesses surrounding him to work out parking details and that. I mean, I met with him, and he's got some good stuff he does, and he's worked with the building department on signage and all that, and he's got planners out there, but there is still things that we put in agreement to do, and I think it's best to make that decision when that time comes, to allow him the opportunity to make those further changes and to reach out to others. That's just my opinion.
Thank you, Mr. Kelch. Mr. DiNardo?
I hear you, and I'm trying to weigh that up. I'd be comfortable voting as well. I know you're not, so I don't want to step on that. So as a way to kind of hit up both, maybe, and I could do it, I'll reach out to the business owner and say by April 15th, if you're able to electronically communicate with all 7 of us a little bit of that presentation that he was able to go through for you, and then have maybe a summary page on the front that kind of ticked off some of the items that I know that we verbally expressed we wanted to see. At least that was distributed and communicated of all of us. And I think, without April 15th was kind of around when we were probably going to meet with him anyway. And then, I know this stinks from like a timing perspective, but we, after receiving that communication, will commit to whenever the next council meeting is, whether it be virtual or something like this, if we can get flat enough on that curve, that we'll just commit to bringing that forward and be prepared to vote, assuming that, we've received that communication from the business owner. Does that make sense?
Thank you, Mr. DiNardo. Mr. Kelch?
Yeah, just to Mr. Thompson, Mr. DiNardo, I think I'd be comfortable with that. I think that would give him the opportunity to do some of the things we agreed on, even if it is a little bit sped up, just given what's going on. I just think it's kind of unfair to us, him, and the other business owner that is involved in it. I think giving him a little more time would be beneficial.
Thank you, Mr. Kelch. Any other unfinished business? Mr. Dracy?
I'd like to go through the chair to the mayor. Just trying to see if there's an update from my last communication to yourself and the Safety Service Director regarding the 4216 Montgomery Road circumstances with SORTA.
Mr. Mayor?
Yes, Mr. Tracy, there has been progress. We did reach out to SORTA, and we're waiting back to hear some information back to them, but we have made contact with them, and we'll see where that goes.
Thank you.
They're aware of the request.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Any other unfinished business? Mr. Braden?
Thank you, Mr. President. Again, I'm sorry, I didn't really hear this discussion down here. So I'd like to make a motion that we vote on Cappy's to allow the Trex transfer, being the situation that we're in, and we don't know when the next time we're going to meet. We've got this guy in limbo. I didn't hear this discussion, so pardon me if I'm, stepping on somebody's, I didn't know. So I'd like to make a motion, we vote to allow Cappy's Trex transfer to be signed.
We have a motion by Mr. Braden to accept the Trex transfer. Is my understanding, Mr. Braden?
Say it.
Your motion is to...
that we vote to allow Mr. Moore to sign
the Trex transfer. We have a motion by Mr. Braden.
Or the mayor, whoever signs it.
Okay. Do we have a second? We don't have a second, Mr. Braden. Any other unfinished business? Moving forward to new business. Do we have any new business? Mr. Gabbard.
Excuse me, I'd like to personally thank our city schools for allowing us to come here tonight, and for our Norwood Public Television for their willingness to make a change, to Ms. Williams and Ms. Valdez for moving everything over here. You know, all of our lives have been disruptive, you know. I want to thank all of our employees. Many of them have, you know, are either working from home or, you know, kind of furloughed right now. Our fire and EMS, Public Works, our health department, our building department, everybody is still doing what needs to be done to keep our city functioning. And so I can't say thank you enough to our citizens. You know, again, our lives have been very much disruptive. You know, I myself have been laid off. I'm out of a job, you know, so I got to make, you know, some changes and things like that. But that's okay. There's people that are in our city that are a whole lot worse shape than I am. So I thank them for their understanding, for their patience, for their cooperation, and we really, it's times like this. It's times like this that make us understand how good we have it. And so I just wanted to thank all those involved and all of our employees for all their work. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gabbard. Mr. Geraci.
I'll kind of echo Mr. Gabbard there and give a thanks also to the mayor. I did get word, along with the rest of us, that the employees that are not currently working as essential employees within the city are still receiving a paycheck, which is absolutely fantastic, that even at being at home and not having to be here doing a job, they're still getting a paycheck. And that was our administration that made that decision, which was absolutely fantastic.
Thank you, Mr. Geraci. Mr. Kelch.
I'd also like to thank the mayor for making sure that we're all getting communication and able to disseminate this information to our wards and Norwood as a whole. I know I sent an email out to you guys saying that some of you guys I've seen putting information out, and I appreciate that. I'm doing that myself, and just letting those in my ward know that they can reach out to me for anything they need. And I would like to encourage everybody to continue doing that as we go through this time that none of us have experienced anything like. I think there's people out there that do read what we put out, and they take that leadership, and I think it gives them a little bit of comfort, and I think that's what we're here for more than just this kind of setting. So I would definitely encourage the members of council and this administration to keep doing that, and just let the people in our wards or Norwood know that we are there for them if anything they need, whether it's getting them in touch with certain information like unemployment services, getting some canned goods, some necessities that they need. Just let them know that we're there for them more than just sitting here saying yeses and nos and arguing the policies that come in front of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kelch. Mr. Bonsall?
Mine's on a different topic, so.
Mr. Geraci.
One thing I almost forgot about is I would like to publicly thank Public Works for their job on Norwood Lateral. I know not every employee at Public Works was involved, but they have all done a fantastic job, at least since I've been on council, including Mr. Zimmerman. He has been very forthcoming. He has been communicating with everybody, and the lateral is starting to look fantastic now. If we can keep people who drive down the road or the residents up behind the lateral from dumping trash on the highway, and keep it looking the way it is, that'd be great.
Thank you, Mr. Geraci. Mr. Bonsall?
Thank you so much. So on that topic, I did want to announce that the state highway cleanup that was scheduled for April 4th, basically it was going to piggyback essentially on all the great work that was done that the mayor and the safety service director and the public works superintendent helped to organize, with ODOT and the city of Cincinnati being some of the partners helping with that. This was going to, very much come back and, clean up whatever that was going to happen. But unfortunately, with just the climate of events, it was going to be on April 4th, my son's first birthday. It's not going to, it won't be able to happen. So we're looking at potentially doing it in the fall and just having a fall cleanup. And get ready to batten down the hatches for winter, I guess, but, instead of the spring one. But either way, we'll keep you updated on that, and I do think Public Works did a great job there.
Thank you, Mr. Bonsall. Mr. Thompson?
This kind of piggybacks off of some things that other people said, but I'd like to recognize the schools and the school teachers again. I've got kids that are out of school, and the teachers continue to call daily to check on the kids, to see how they're doing on their lessons, to offer help. I know that all the teachers across the schools are doing that. I also know that the schools are still providing free breakfast and lunch for those kids and families who need it. It's just, I feel lucky that we have such good schools that can do that for our kids who need that. And it really touches me, and I just want to thank them publicly for doing it.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Mr. DiNardo?
Mine's a little bit mundane, but I was going to try to ask Maria about if there's, I think this falls under new business, if there's any kind of plan of action around the compromise, the semi-virtual or paper reduction that we were going to have with our packets. Is that something that we were going to see? I know I felt like it was pretty light, but because but there was still some of the supporting information in there, which is, I think, a good thing. But it's to you and I guess to council, we're going to move forward here in the next, whatever the next meeting is, with that kind of like compromise scenario.
Sure. Well, it was my understanding that what we're going to do is continue to send the packages via email on, Friday, and then, amendments as they come up by Laura. And then if there's anyone who particularly would like a paper package, like a full paper package for a meeting, to let Laura know, and she'll be happy to print that and have that available for you at the meeting. Otherwise, I thought that our, kind of understanding was that we would probably print, or that we would print like a copy of the ordinances, so you guys can see those for everybody. If there's anything else in particular that people would like to have printed for them, then please let us know. Laura's happy to go ahead and do that and have that available at the meetings. At this point, my understanding was that we were no longer going to be delivering paper packages, on a Friday, since everything was going to be sent virtually. If there's any specific reason why someone would need something or need a paper package for some reason, let us know. Happy to help.
So that's, just to confirm, that's go forward now, right?
That was my understanding.
Cool. No, I'm down. That's just one of them.
Mr. Bonsall?
Thank you, Mr. President. So I know that we'll be getting these documents emailed to us. It would be nice if there's any way that it could be, maybe a Dropbox could be set up that could just be organized by meeting date that we could throw these documents into, and just so that it'll be easier for me to go back and just find them, if that's possible. If not, it's not a big deal.
I don't believe Dropbox is probably a good idea, just because they have storage limits.
Oh.
But Google Docs, and I think you were the one who mentioned Google Docs before, and I know the city has a Google account. You might be able to do that. My goal is still to be able to get it onto the council website. I know that Laura asked the company that handles our website about doing that, and just taking the files and zipping them and, dropping it there, just to avoid any space issues. As far as I know, she hasn't really heard back from them, but with everything going on, I'm not super surprised.
Sure.
But that is the ultimate goal, is to make the packages available to everyone, so that the residents can see, what's going on, their public information anyway.
Any further new business? Mr. Bonsall?
Thank you, Mr. President. So I kind of wanted to bring up, if we truly need the motion first to have the discussion, that's fine. But potentially how we might, we've gotten a lot of business done today, but potentially how we might not meet at that first meeting in April and or the second meeting. I was kind of thinking that if we might want to consider this, that we leave leave it up to both the mayor and the president of council, that if they both agree that this meeting is not needed, that there's not things that have to get passed, if both of them agree, not just one but both, that potentially would give them, the president of council then the flexibility to cancel our next meeting. I have been talking to, I did talk to Bridget Kelly, and, I'm hearing from the state, just based on some of the broadcasts, that they're working on trying to figure out ways that local governments can meet virtually, but I don't know if that's what's going to happen there. So potentially, I'd like I said, to give flexibility. So, I'll go ahead and make the motion. If it gets seconded, that's great, but if not, no worries. But I'm going to make the motion that we, with the approval of both the mayor and the president of council, that we give them the discretion to cancel our first and our second meeting in April at the time, if there's no business that needs to get done.
So we have a motion by Mr. Bonsall to give discretion to the mayor and the president of council to decide if we should have a meeting in, first and second meeting in April. Is that my understanding?
Yes.
Okay, I understand.
Do we have a second? Mr. DiNardo?
Yeah, that makes sense.
We have a second by Mr. DiNardo.
Sorry, discussion after.
Any discussion?
Yeah, and I think the reason I kind of wanted to second that is my interpretation is that the first one, unlikely in April, but if we start to look better, it at least gives you the opportunity to assess and potentially still hold a second meeting in April, right? That's kind of the intent you were going for. That's the way I interpreted it. Cool. That's great.
Mr. Geraci?
I guess I'm okay with it. I think we need to try to keep business as usual. Try to keep the government moving as much as we can and not let us shut down and not represent our constituents as much as we can. I think if we have to sit in this setup for a couple meetings, then we have to sit in this setup for a couple meetings. But I think we need to, as a council, try to keep our government moving as much as we can.
Thank you, Mr. Geraci. I would like to ask Mr. Moore, first of all, how does this fall under Ohio Revised Code? Is this something that is at our discretion, or how does that work?
I honestly have no idea if you can cancel a regular council meeting. As a practical matter, you could send out an agenda that says there's nothing to discuss, and if only 4 people show up, you don't have a quorum, so you don't have a meeting. And I doubt anybody's going to ask the police to go and round up members and force them to come. So that is a practical matter the way it works. The one question I had is I think there's a public hearing set for one of the April meetings.
It's the second meeting.
For the second meeting.
Correct.
So just that's something to keep in mind as far as what needs to be done, if that's going to be extended, if that's going to be pushed back again.
I believe that's the 24th, if I'm not mistaken. Mr. Bonsall?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. President. So, yeah, those were, it's good feedback. On we have canceled council meetings before by a vote of council. The last meeting in 2019, the last meeting in December, it would have fallen, I think, on Christmas Day or Christmas Eve. So we got all our business done by December 10th, and we voted to cancel it. So I would think that this would be something similar. Maybe we weren't supposed to do that in the past, but I also think that our council rules are where, I think that's where our meeting dates are set. I don't think Ohio Revised Code sets how often we have to meet. So long story short is I would think that a 2/3 vote of council would, because that's what it takes to suspend the rules, would do that, but open to that. It was mentioned about the function of the city. Well, thankfully, council is not necessarily required for the city to function on a regular basis. Yes, there's actions that we have to take, but we have set stuff in place when it comes to our appropriations, our budget. The city has elected a mayor who's appointed officers of the city to run it. So I don't have any fear of the city not functioning. My only concern was all of the work that it takes to put this on, and because that we did, especially putting it on at an alternate location, and just all of us, again, getting together at a time that, it's discouraged, even though we're 6 feet apart, but it's still discouraged for so many people to be getting together. I would like to, knowing about the public hearing, I would maybe like to amend that motion just to for just the first meeting in April. So that would be the April, I think, 14th. Yeah, the April 14th meeting, if Mr. DiNardo is okay with that.
Yeah, I'm willing to do that, but I kind of want to ask something. The way, as I said when I was trying to confirm my interpretation or my understanding, we're not voting to cancel it per se. We're voting for the discretion to evaluate the state of play and say, does this make sense or not? For all of those reasons, knowing today, in my opinion, we're told to stay back, and unless there's a real reason for us to meet, and I think that's why we had 11 ordinances and so many emergencies, was to avoid exactly that. So in my mind, I think we can still keep it, because all we're asking is for a majority of us to say, you can make a call if you want to make a call. So really what we're saying is, do we trust the two of them to make the appropriate call? And I'm motioning yes. That's why I'd like to keep it. So does that change anything for you?
No, that makes sense. Actually, yeah, that makes sense. So I'll leave it how it is, I guess. And
yeah.
Okay. Mr. Moore?
No, I just wanted to make the note when it comes to the public hearing, and Mr. Moore can, let me know if I'm wrong, but we just need to provide 30 days notice. So if the council decides pretty quickly that we're not going to have it on, the second meeting in April, then we can have the clerk or the secretary send out a new notice pretty quickly and, do it in the May meeting.
We're not at 30 days though.
Mr. Moore?
Listening to what Mr. Bonzel, Mr. DiNardo were saying, if you're really going to do the proper procedure, I think the way to do it is for council to vote to cancel those meetings with the understanding that the president of council or the mayor can call a council meeting.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And so council could vote tonight to, we're not going to have that meeting. We're not going to have the April 14th, and we're not going to have the April 28th meeting, with the understanding that either one of you can call a council meeting, or 3 members of council can decide we're going to call a council meeting for a particular day. The difference would be then it would be a special council meeting, so there's different notice requirements, but that would be the alternative way to go. But yeah, I don't know. There's just thoughts off the top of my head. I'm not sure there's a right answer today. Because the rule, I expect that the state legislature will likely do something sometime in the next couple of weeks, but we don't know what that's going to be yet.
Okay.
Mr. DiNardo?
I know for anyone watching, this sounds really messy and unorganized, but it's simply because we don't really know what we're supposed to do exactly. So to James, if you just want to change it up and just make it a motion to cancel the first one, I'm happy to support that too, and then we can just evaluate what it looks like in April. I'm okay with that, if you wanted to change that. Just knowing what he said.
Yeah.
Mr. Bonzel?
So, yes, I'd like to, I guess, amend that motion. Is that the way to do it? Or should I just withdraw?
You can withdraw.
I'll just withdraw the motion that I made.
Yeah, second.
You withdraw your second. Okay. Mr. Bonzel?
Okay, so I would like to make a motion to just go ahead and then cancel the first meeting in April. That'd be the April 14th meeting, with the understanding, of course, that the mayor or president of council can call a special meeting, or 3 members of council can call a special meeting as well at any time. So you all also have that discretion to do that if you decide.
So we have a motion by Mr. Bonzel to cancel the first meeting in April.
Yes.
Do I have a second? Second by Mr. DiNardo.
Yes.
Any discussion? Mr. Dracy?
I'm just going to come out and say I still don't think it's a good idea. I mean, I guess I'm the oddball out of the group, but I get a paycheck. This is what I do. This is what we all do, and I think we need to be here. We need, even if there's nothing on the agenda, we're getting paid to do this.
Mr. Kelch?
If I could, to respond, my interpretation of this is we're just taking a precautionary measure in the event that it gets bad where we cannot meet, and it's probably not wise to meet, with the understanding that we could call it if it's not.
That's right.
At that point, so it's not like we're trying to dodge anything in my book, or in my head, the way I'm interpreting. To me, it's just a precautionary measure that we may or may not take. We're just planning it in advance to be within the laws and guidelines. Is that correct?
I would say guidelines, not laws, but yeah, guidelines have been issued, so.
Mrs. Williams?
I just wanted to make a comment. I know that, I'm not on council, but I am here in these meetings for a reason. And I think that we, and I include myself in this, are city leaders. And as leaders, we need to provide a good example. And, the state has been very clear, DeWine has been very clear that larger groups should not be meeting, even taking into consideration the fact that we are 6 feet apart. There's still an inherent danger in this. I know many of us have small children, grandchildren, friends, neighbors, parents that are immunocompromised. We got a lot done in this meeting today. Should there be an emergency, then, great, we can work on that or work on meeting electronically, as the State Attorney General has noted in his opinion is possible and acceptable. But in the meantime, I believe that we should be setting a good example and should not be meeting if at all possible.
Thank you, Mrs. Williams. Any further discussion?
Thanks.
Any further discussion? So the motion is to cancel the first meeting in April.
Yes.
That's what we're voting on. Please call the roll.
Mr. Bonso?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Geraci?
No.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present, voting 6 ayes, 1 no. Motion passes. Any further new business? Move on to item P, communications. We have one letter from Mayor Schneider. Mrs. Williams.
Letter dated March 20th of 2020, addressed to Norwood City Council, Ken Miracle, President of Council, regarding amendment to agenda superintendent appointment. Hello, President Miracle. I request that the attached letter be amended into the agenda for the council meeting on Tuesday, March 24th, 2020. Sincerely, Victor Schneider, Mayor of Norwood. The attached letter addressed to the Norwood City Council, also dated March 20th of 2020, regarding Superintendent of Public Works appointment of Clint Zimmerman. Esteemed members of City Council, I write this letter requesting approval to appoint Clint Zimmerman as the Superintendent of Public Works for the City of Norwood at a rate higher than the minimum set standard. Listed below is the justification for this request. Mr. Zimmerman has been a member of Public Works Department over 23 years. He has held a leadership role in the department since 2002. Certified by the Ohio EPA as a Class 2 water distribution operator. Mr. Zimmerman is skilled and knowledgeable in EPA rules and regulations, blueprint reading, project organization, operational monitoring, process development, communications, and is proficient in MS Office, as well as all aspects of our Public Works Department. Mr. Zimmerman's communication skills, planning, as well as diplomacy and tact have been put to good use since he assumed the interim superintendent position in January. He has impressed me and Director Murphy with his ability to, quote-unquote, make it happen. I respectfully request that with this letter you approve his appointment at the annual salary of $66,500. This amount has been placed into the financial recovery plan. Sincerely, Victor Schneider, Mayor of Norwood.
Mr. Gabbard.
I make a motion that we receive, file, and approve this appointment.
Motion by Mr. Gabbard to receive, file, and approve. Mr. Kelch.
I'd like to second.
Second by Mr. Kelch. Any discussion? Mr. Gabbard.
It's already been made mention a couple times tonight. I've made mention of it in the past. In these first 90 days of Clint stepping up into this role has been, to say remarkable would be not even close. Anytime you call, email, reach out to him, he is very responsive, not only to your call or email or with text, but he responds with action. and gets it done. And it's not just him, it's been everybody, every department head, it's been the administration, and all of us, when I've reached out to any of them. But Clint has done a remarkable job, deserves this position.
Thank you, Mr. Gabbard. Mr. Kelch.
I'd like to echo on back what Mr. Gabbard said there. Clint he's the guy for the job. I know I've said that to Mayor Schneider a couple times at least. Hitting the ground running, he's been great, very responsive. He's helped the Parks, Recs, and Public Spaces Committee out quite a bit since we've been in. We kind of all came into this together, and he's definitely, he's a guy who hustles. He gets stuff done. And to be honest, even though it's over the minimum, I think we're getting a steal on him.
Thank you, Mr. Kelch. Mr. Bonsall.
Thank you, Mr. President. It is over the minimum, but it's still under the, I guess if you have the mid-range for the salary for the Public Works Superintendent, I think Mr. Zimmerman's experience in the department and, with the water system, even though he wasn't in charge of it, he was just, but he knows where things are, he knows how things run. I think having him there, I think that there's definitely huge value to having that. And I've had a chance to meet with him through a meeting with ODOT, and he's extremely professional, knowledgeable, doesn't overstep, what his knowledge. He always says, I'll get back to you if he doesn't know something. So it's appreciated. And I honestly think that, I really think we couldn't find a better person for that position than Clint Zimmerman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bonsall. Any further discussion? So we have a motion and a second to receive and file and approve the appointment. Please call the roll.
Mr. Bonsall?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye. Motion passes. Item Q, all members are present. Item R, adjournment. Mr. Bonsall.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would move that we adjourn.
Motion by Mr. Bonsall. Do I have a second? Mr. Thompson.
Second.
Second by Mr. Thompson. Please call the roll.
Mr. Bonsall?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye. We are adjourned.